The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs, who is normally in Johannesburg, South Africa, but today joins me all the way on the other side of the world here in China. Very good evening to you, Cobus from Beijing.
Good evening.
It's so exciting. We have an all-China podcast today for the first time. This is the first all-China podcast, and you and I were in Johannesburg, and we did an all-Joburg podcast. So I guess it's only fair and fitting now that we're both together in China.
Yes, together in the two different cities.
Together in the country, not quite in the city. Next week, you'll come down to Shanghai. So you are in China for what's called a think tank forum, a conference. We're going to talk about that. But before we get to what you're doing here in China, because it is absolutely fascinating, and I'm really jealous of the fact that I can't join you on all the outings and excursions that you're doing, I want to give a little bit of a shout out to some folks who have just been so nice to us in the program over the past couple weeks. First to Rolaki, who is a listener from Toronto, who was on a 3-day trip passing through China and took some of her time on her vacation to come and see me and say hello and tell us how much she enjoys the show. And we spent 2 hours at Starbucks talking about China, Africa. Also, Siyu, who's going to be a Schwartzman Scholar in Beijing, up there where you are, Cobus, right now. She too passed through, and she said that we were part of the inspiration for her starting her own Women and Gender Issues in China podcast. So we are humbled by that. And it's just so really exciting to meet you guys. And so if you are passing through Johannesburg or through Shanghai, send us an email. It's not a guarantee that we're always available, but when we are available, we'd love to hang out with you and grab a coffee and just kind of catch up and meet you and hear about what your thoughts are. And it was really just exciting to meet those folks. I also want to do a very, very quick apology. We didn't have a show last week. It was for no fault of our own, but Cobus was traveling, a guest canceled, and it's just kind of what happens in the summer months when it gets a little bit complicated. So we do 50 shows a year. We take 1 week off for Christmas, and usually there's one kind of goof week in the summer, and this was it. So we are back. And so we just thought it'd be a great opportunity since Cobus is here in Beijing, and he's with a lot of African scholars. He's engaging with a lot of Chinese academics as well to kind of hear more about what he's doing and also about the program and to kind of reflect on where we are now in China-Africa relations 3 months ahead of what will probably be the most important summit for 53 African leaders, Cobus. I'm not sure if Swaziland is going to make it in time to get to Beijing.
We'll see it.
There's still time left. They're negotiating hard to flip Swaziland from Taiwan to China, and they'll get it right. They'll try and get it right up to the last minute. So let's just dive into what you are doing in Beijing and tell us a little bit about the conference before we get into some of the issues that you're talking about.
So I'm at what's called the China-Africa Think Tank Forum, which is a big gathering of think tanks mostly. So some of them are related to universities and some of them are not. And they're all together, like roughly half of them are Chinese think tanks and the rest of them are dotted across the African continent. And they essentially come together in this big meeting. It's not really a conference as such. It's a lot of micro presentations, all within a very kind of controlled official environment. And they do all of these short presentations, and then they kind of boil them down into talking points, essentially, which are then going, I think, essentially feeding into the Chinese government's line, or like the set of topics that they're interested in discussing around FOCAC. In some kind of nebulous way, it feeds into the FOCAC process. So I'm here doing this, and then I'm also doing research for SIRE, and then I'm also attending another conference next week, which is on peace and security.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the people who are there, the scholars, the academics that are joining you. This both from the African side and the Chinese side. Are they old? Are they young? Are they male? Are they female? Do they, paint me a picture of what the crowd is like and who the attendees are.
They're all pretty senior, so they're mostly in middle age, and they tend to be heads of think tanks or kind of senior researchers. And so I think the idea is that they are really representing kind of the voice of the establishment in lots of ways, and that they have this kind of seniority that can then also add gravity to whatever they're saying, in an official capacity. They tend to, there's more men than women, but many women. And from the African side, they really are from all over. Like you see a development of more China studies, I think, in Africa at the moment. So there are representatives from China centers from different African universities, one from Nigeria, one from Tanzania, some from South Africa. And then on the China side, they're mostly from official think tanks, which means that they are either related to universities or related to the government in some kind of official way, or both. Frequently in China, you could be located with university, but also do work for the government.
It sounds potentially very, very interesting, but it also sounds potentially incredibly boring. And I say this because there's a little bit, I'm serious about this in the sense that think tanks in this country, in China, are heavily regulated, much like they are in the media. So it's not the same as what we would think about a think tank in, say, the West, or even at SAIA in Johannesburg, where there is much more unfiltered, unfettered discussion and thought, whereas think tanks are almost extensions of official policy and public and government thinking in that sense. And so I'm interested, when you have discussions with your Chinese counterparts, are you getting really just the official line, or are you getting subtlety and discussion and nuance in their comments?
I think, it's always think tank people, and yeah, kind of, I'm relatively new to this particular field, but they tend to be a different form of diplomat frequently, or some of them have spent time in diplomacy, before some then move on from think tanks to diplomacy, and so they tend to be diplomatic. They know how to put things, in a way that don't ruffle feathers. Let me put it that way. Yeah. And so that is what they do. That doesn't mean that they sugarcoat things, but it's not like an academic conference where you would, where there's more of an emphasis on individual flair. Here at this kind of think tank conference, people are there in official capacity, and the entire forum, one has to be clear, the entire forum is explicitly part of the FOCAC process. So, that kind of, if you look at on Google Images, if you see, any kind of official FOCAC event, or also an official Chinese government spokesperson news conference, they have the kind of blue background with the very kind of large type, the massive FOCAC logo on the back, in front of a lectern. It's that, it's explicitly this is an explicit Chinese government, event. So it follows
Sure.
that kind of line.
So let's put a little bit of context to what's been happening in China over I'd say it's about a month and a half. So for those of you not familiar, FOCAC is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It is every 3 years, basically, is an enormous summit. And it's really, I think, the largest summit of African leaders that happens periodically. I don't think there's any other grouping that pulls together more African leaders in one space at one time than FOCAC. And this year, it's going to be in September in Beijing. And part of that, what's happening now, is we're seeing in China, mostly in Beijing, I would assume, but these conferences and these forums. So a couple weeks ago, there was the China-Africa Media Forum, where they brought journalists over from Africa to experience China, to learn about China, to participate in these kind of seminars like what Cobus is doing. Right now, actually, parallel to what Cobus is doing on the Think Tank Forum, is a defense ministers forum. There are 50 African defense ministers or military chiefs in Beijing right now. It's interesting because you probably wouldn't know it, and there's no flags on the street, but this is probably one of the largest gatherings of African defense ministers anywhere in the world, and that's going on. And so we're seeing this frenetic activity now leading up to the next 3 months, leading up to FOCAC. about different sectors and segments of African society that are coming to Beijing. Oftentimes they're coming at the expense of the Chinese government, which is a nice thing because it is incredibly expensive now in China and to fly here and to stay here. So in that sense, it's pretty cool that all these people are getting to come here. Let's talk a little bit about the African side, Cobus, and this is reflecting on your own experience as well. You've been to China several times. It sounds like maybe some of the scholars are relatively new, possibly coming to China, but some of them have probably been coming back and forth for decades. What's the kind of the temperature in the room among your African colleagues?
Most of them are veterans of the China-Africa space. So some of them are here for the first time, but a lot of them, this is what they do. So they tend to be in and out of China a lot. So they are used to the process, and they are they're engaged in China-Africa issues. So that is what they're focusing on. In relation to the different kind of forums going on, I should also point out that this isn't unique to the China-Africa space. This is a summit economy, basically, that is running around different kinds of summits. So all of these big forums that are happening in the FOCAC space, they also would be happening around the G20, for example, which is also the G20 summit is this year, obviously. It's every year, but, this year it's happening in Argentina. 2 years ago it was in China. So they would have a similar kind of process where you would have large-scale meetings, for business leaders, for women's leaders, for civil society, and for think tanks. And in fact, the G20 process is actually even bigger, with more meetings, more working groups, more papers being delivered. And so you would see the same thing with the BRICS conference, which is coming up in July, or the Indian Ocean Rim Association conference, which is also happening this year. So it's a kind of global engine of people kind of moving from meeting to meeting, and getting together talking points, to discuss when these presidents get together for a summit.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
This year feels like it should be different, and I would be surprised if, again, this is your first time doing this, so you're not going to have any ability to reflect back on previous years, but this year things are different. This is the era of Donald Trump. This is the era of uncertainty. This is the new era under Xi Jinping as permanent president. This is era of a much stronger China, but at the same time a China that also feels very vulnerable right now as it faces a potential trade war with the United States. There's also been, tremendous pressure building on the Chinese about their so-called debt book diplomacy, and in Africa and other countries around the world. So I'm wondering if any of these anxieties or the current geopolitical state that we're experiencing, both here in China and in other countries, is being felt and reflected at the think tank forum among the participants there. What are you picking up on any of that?
It came up a lot more explicitly than that. Actually, it came up in a lot of the official presentations, albeit in coded form. As everything always happens in the China-Africa space, it happens in coded discourse. But it is interesting that there's a new theme that who knows if it's new, but I spotted it for the first time this time. So it's a repeated mention of the phrase a community with a shared future. So that is, kind of, and it comes up in different versions. So it essentially is a global community with a shared destiny. And that comes up a lot suddenly. And it seems to me that it is a kind of a coded way of positioning the China-Africa and therefore also South-South relationship as the new center of globalization.
It would also, sorry to interrupt you, but it also might be a slap at Donald Trump and his more unilateralist positions. And China is saying we are an open multilateralist partner, which again is rather a complex issue in China because it's never black or white. China, at the one hand, is saying it wants to have a cooperative multilateral world, but the other hand still has a highly controlled economy that has a lot of barriers to entry, and China doesn't necessarily play nice with all of its neighbors in the region. So there are, everything with China is really all about the contradictions and understanding the contradictions. But certainly, it seems like Xi Jinping is trying to position China as a counterweight to American protectionism, and that China is not going to play by this. And that does seem interesting that it's actually filtering all the way down to the think tanks. Today you said you went on a junket, on a tour. And it's funny because when you told me this afternoon that you were going on a tour, I kind of thought like, oh, well, you're going to go see the Great Wall or you're going to do something like that. And it actually turns out you went to a free trade zone and looking at special economic zones, but particularly for high tech. And this is so interesting because just this past week in Djibouti, they launched their free trade zone. And a lot of these special economic zones, free trade zones, whatever you want to call them in Africa, are in fact modeled on what the Chinese have done in places like Shenzhen, here in Shanghai, and other places like that. So I'm curious, talk to us a little bit about the experience today when you went out to the special economic zone or the free trade zone, and what was the reaction of your African colleagues who were with you along the way?
We went to an incubation center, which is in Dongshen, which is China's Silicon Valley, essentially, and it's a series of facilities where startups are essentially nestled and coddled until they can stand on their own 2 feet. They are very supportive of startups. It's a surprisingly supportive environment, like where they help startups to develop products for markets. They find them partners, they work with them, and these startups frequently would even be students or frequently actually university people who are branching off into startups, and then they essentially, these fledgling companies are supported in a myriad different ways, including things like providing them with desks, for example, all the way to them actually launching into the market. And one of their big success stories is a company which I'm now blanking on the name on, which it produces a form of, it looks very similar to the Segway electric scooter. It's also a two-wheel kind of hoverboardy kind of scooter that you lean forward and you move forward on. That's one of their. It's had big success in different global markets. So it's one of their success stories. So and it's all in this kind of complex of different kinds of new industries, which include things like hydroponic agriculture, for example. So it's all very focused on ecological development and on new technology.
That sounds absolutely fascinating, and it's something that I would actually love to see myself. I'm just curious, what do you think the point of today's excursion was? Why did they bring a bunch of think tank scholars out to see a high-tech incubation park, and what did they want you to take away from that?
I think they want to take us to take away the centrality of special economic zones in China's development. That is something that was also a big theme right throughout the think tank forum, where there was, there's this double message from China always in this respect. On the one hand, they say that they don't suggest that other countries take on China's development model as is. Kind of because it was specifically for China, dealing with Chinese circumstances. But then after that, they say that, a whole bunch of mechanisms that China used in its development would actually be very good for other countries to adopt. And special economic zones is number one in that. So China's been very efficient in arranging special economic zones in different parts of Africa. And a lot of the ones that had been lagging behind are now online. So there were all reports about economic zones in Nigeria, for example, that are now actually up and running. And of course, the ones in Ethiopia are the kind of jewel in the crown. And I think it was an example of how China uses special economic zones to incubate new technologies, and also kind of a showcase of this Made in China 2025 high technology program, which the Trump administration is very against. It's a kind of a showcase of how China is leading in different kinds of new technology areas.
Yeah, so that Made in China 2025 program are basically all of the key industries of the future that China is hoping to use to advance its economy. So it's artificial intelligence, it's electric vehicles, it's autonomous vehicles, it's robotics, and a lot of those kind of areas which are so important, especially for China as it's facing its demographic bomb because its population is actually declining and graying. And so it's trying to use automation and artificial intelligence to help spur economic growth and keep it going. Cobus, you've talked about how the Chinese have promoted this idea of special economic zones, yet everybody that you and I have spoke with over the years who is familiar with those special economic zones in Africa, whether it's in Namibia, Mauritius, Nigeria, and even Ethiopia. Most recently, we spoke with a journalist from The Guardian. There's really been mixed results. And I just wonder if there's a sensitivity on the Chinese side to understanding that it takes more than building a park with good infrastructure, but there's a governance question, there's a tax question, there's a labor issue, there's a supply chain factors that have to all be weighed into it, and there's a whole ecosystem that supports these special economic zones, and those work extraordinarily well here, but may not translate well to Africa. Did you get any sense of that, maybe that hesitation that this model doesn't transfer as well as maybe the Chinese hope it will?
There was a lot of talk about what's needed to make it work. A lot of it, they were quite explicit about the different aspects of Chinese governance and electricity provision and data networks and so on that all go into making a special economic zone work. And so that essentially becomes a kind of a laundry list for African countries, on their way to development. So it's not, I don't think it's necessarily hesitance. It's more a realistic view that pulling this off is not easy. And that it takes a full commitment from a government and a kind of a marshalling of resources that I think that they were quite clear that many African countries don't necessarily have all those resources in place to marshal. But in cases where they do and where it makes business sense, like for example in Ethiopia, there's a whole bunch of Chinese tools kind of ready to be used. And the Chinese government is very enthusiastic about rolling them out. Of course, all of those things come at a price. And so the issue of debt did come up, mostly in relation to saying that the Chinese position on African debt has been misconstrued in the Western press. The Western press narrative that China essentially uses debt as a kind of a form of strategic leverage. A lot of people from the Chinese Academy came out against that. And saying that, making the point that China is actually a lot more cautious about debt and a lot more concerned about debt sustainability than they get credit for, which I think is probably true. That's how I tend to see it. But within that there is it comes back to the story that look, China developed. They were extremely successful in developing. They did it in this particular way, and they feel that some of the ways that they did it is specific to China, but some of them are scalable to different environments, and this is how they feel it should be scaled. And then it becomes a question of whether this is actually right for Africans, and that Africa has to decide.
Yeah, let's not forget that many of your African think tank colleagues, as you said, they are older. When they were children, China was as poor or poorer than their home countries in Africa today. And in their lifetime, just in the past 25 years, China has gone from being one of the poorest countries in the world to the second largest economy in the world. It's really a remarkable journey, and it must be very profound for them as they're seeing kind of what Beijing is like. It's hard to explain how a country in 25 years can transform from being rustic, backwards, developing to modern, advanced. And Beijing is not anywhere near as modern as Shanghai is, but still it is, I was there 30 years ago, and it is just mind-blowing, the transformation that's gone on. So what Cobus has been doing is part of this, again, this run-up to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that happens in September. It sounds like there's a lot of enthusiasm that's being built, both, among the Chinese and African scholars, but also we've got defense chiefs that are now in Beijing on I think it's like a 2 weeks, Cobus. They're like on a 10-day, 2-week junket there with meeting with their Chinese counterparts. A couple weeks ago, Chinese media, I think artists are also going to be coming over. And it's really all these people-to-people exchanges. And so if for nothing else, Cobus, I'm hoping they put you up in a nice hotel and you're getting some good food. And you're getting to meet and see a lot of people, which is really, in this day and age, we can't take that for granted. I think it's super valuable.
Yeah, it's an amazing privilege to be here. It's very interesting to see all of these FOCAC mechanisms in action. It's massive, and it's very interesting to see.
So coming up next, we're going to have another discussion about conferences, and we're going to be talking this time about a big event that happened in Europe. And so we'll be having that on our next program. Cobus will still be in China, so we'll kind of continue getting updates from him and his adventures here in China. But this time he'll be coming down to see me in Shanghai. And it'll be interesting to get your perspective, Cobus, on the differences in the attitudes and tones between Beijing and Shanghai, because I think a lot of our listeners may not understand the subtleties, just the feeling, the kind of the feeling in the air. Shanghai, of course, being a much more commercial city, less political, not as focused on arts and culture and history, whereas Beijing typically is kind of, it's a government center, a capital for that. So we'll have that discussion coming up next week. Again, just as I said at the top of the program, we love hearing from you. We love seeing you. We love kind of interacting with you online. All of our contact information is available on our website. By the way, a brand new website, if you haven't checked it out recently. We have redesigned the website for the first time in 8 years, so we hope that you can take a visit at ChinaAfricaProject.com. There's contact information there. You can email me directly at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com, and I will make sure that Cobus gets it if you're passing through Johannesburg. And of course, if you're coming through Shanghai, please do let me know. We do always love to interact and engage with our fans. So we'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at @eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.